Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first afternoon tertulia. I'm your host, Kimberly Roa, Centro Special Projects Coordinator, and we're so excited to have you here today, and we hope you're ready to get into it as author and professor Sherina Feliciano and Centro Directora Yarimar Bonilla explore the encounters and motivations of Boricua and Taíno activists and the debate surrounding them in the Puerto Rican and Caribbean diaspora in New York City, Bonilla. Without further ado, please help me welcome Sherina and Yarimar.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you to the team. Thank you to our interpreters that make our events more inclusive to everyone. And thank you everyone for logging in for this conversation. But most of all, thank you, Sherina, for making time to talk to me about your book. I'm so excited. So I should have a copy of your book to wave around, but of course I've been reading it on my Kindle on my phone. So,
back there.
but it's back there. A beautiful cover, by the way. Gray Star posters and made them very lovely. I want to start. I know this is a book that you began as a graduate student. These books have a long trajectory. So many years of hard work and editing and re-editing. So, but can we go back to when you were still a graduate student and just starting to think about dissertation topics? How did you become interested in thinking and writing about Taino identity and the Taino movement?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Yarimar, for that question. And thank you, everyone, before I get started, for showing interest in this topic and coming here today. I really am grateful to be able to talk about my work. So I just wanted to start by, thanking everyone. And reflecting, like you said, these projects are the result of really long processes, especially, I think, not to but in anthropology field work and the planning and the funding and the writing, which in itself is a form of analysis, take a lot of time. So a lot of this work emerged back when I was in Puerto Rico over the summer at my parents' house. My parents are my mom is from Vieques, but I grew up in San Sebastian. Well, it was just to sort of give that a little bit of history. I grew up in Chicago until I was 9, moved to Puerto Rico, moved to San Sebastian, and that's where my family home was until pretty recently. So I was there for the summer, and I saw an article in the newspaper regarding Taíno protest at Caguana. And having grown up within the island and going to schools in the island, what I had been taught in the schools was that the Taíno were extinct. So for me, seeing this in the newspaper was just to be completely transparent, a source of curiosity, but also of confusion. At the time, what it felt like was an impossible thing. And I remember calling my best friend, who was also in Puerto Rico for the summer, and being like, have you seen this? And we just sort of were in shock and really confused. And, it just kind of stuck with me. I was like, they're Taíno. And one of the things that I realized in really thinking about this were my own stereotypes of what that would look like, and how in some ways the stereotypes of what that would look like and made impossible really taking at that time seriously what I was encountering for the first time. So I went to graduate school. I went back, and I was supposed to have been doing some preliminary field work that summer, but the topic that I thought I had worked on wasn't one that was kind of moving forward in terms of what I was thinking about. And instead, what kind of came up across papers, I was talking about a paper that I wanted to write regarding Puerto Rico and sort of nativistic movements and the figure of the Jíbaro, not really tied to the Taíno. And I had someone ask me, are there any sort of indigenous groups in Puerto Rico? And I was like, no, was my immediate response. And then I thought about it. It's like, well, I read about this thing over the summer. And that led to me talking to my advisor at the time, Barbara Meek. And one of the things that she said when I told her about this was she checked me. So I was like, oh, you know, this isn't, at that time, one of the things that I thought, I was like, this isn't possible, you know, I don't know who these people are. And she said to me, she looked at me and she's like, you know, that's what a lot of people say regarding her expertise as a Native American groups within the US and within Canada, First Nations. And one of the things that she said is like, that's what a lot of people say about Native groups. Have you read about settler colonialism? Have you read about these topics? And I hadn't at that time, because I was really interested much more in migratory paths between Puerto Ricans in the diaspora in Puerto Rico. Having been a return migrant myself, I was really fascinated by that experience of exclusion in Puerto Rico. And what that led to then was a shift in how I approached the question, a shift in reflecting upon my own senses of knowledge and ways of knowing, that led me to then approach the issue of Taíno from a different vantage point, which wasn't as invested. I didn't find it very productive. I would get stuck if I was trying to describe something as it existed rather than its diversity and vitality. If I tried to take a normative, fixed approach to an essence that I should be able to find, because that was based in my stereotypes and the representational sort of regimes that I learned in school. And instead to see kind of what people said about themselves as a source that I took seriously, to understand how people approach their own histories and to take that seriously, and to listen instead of to assume that I already knew the answers. And for me, that shift was kind of the mental space I was in when I went to field work, and was part of the process of me coming to this topic in an honest way. It wasn't, you know, one that came to me because I always knew. And one of the things that I hope to sort of talk about is how we navigate changing our minds or changing our thoughts or our ways of approaching things over time. Because even the me that did the research, the bulk of which was in 2006 to 2008, has come to rethink lots of things as I move in my sort of approach to the work. So I think that kind of gives you a sense of how I came to the topic, and, you know, very as honest as I can be regarding sort of where I was and, you know, kind of where I came to be through the process of preparing for field work.
Well, and how was it when you decided on this topic? What was the reaction of your advisors or friends, etc.? Because I have to confess, when I was in graduate school, I was very interested also in the Taino movements, and I was particularly interested in I mean, I didn't explore this in depth, so I want to hear from you if you found this to be true. But I felt that there was a strong, you know, that the Taino movements were very strong in the diaspora. And I was kind of interested about why it was that it was folks, you know, outside of the archipelago that were really, you know, identifying with this indigenous identity. But when I, you know, as a young graduate student, still very, you know, starting out and not entirely confident, giving presentations and kind of testing out this topic, I got, you know, I was really dissuaded from writing about this. And a lot of people were really dismissive of these movements and of it as an area of study. So I congratulate you for taking this seriously and doing a true anthropological approach, you know, of really listening to folks and taking folks as authorities and experts on their own lives, right? So can you talk a little bit about any pushback that you might have experienced with this topic?
Yeah, so there are like different sources of sort of pushback and different strategies I had to deal with in order to sort of manage the pushback. On the one hand, you know, I went to a graduate school where at the time of me sort of putting together the proposal, the audience that I had, you know, there wasn't at that time that I can recall, because I think I would have had them on my committee, any Puerto Rican faculty in anthropology. So their perspective, what I had to do is explain to them how controversial of a topic this was. So a lot of what I had to do for them was really highlight that what is happening within these Taino movements is not, isn't like a matter of it's recognized on one level and not on another, like trying to explain what it is like from the perspective of broader, widespread Puerto Rican discourse, the challenges that people are encountering. And at that time, I didn't know what the field work would look like on the ground, but I knew that much at that particular moment. In terms of when I got to Puerto Rico, I had my own friends and people I hung out with. When you're doing field work, you're not just like field working all the time, especially if you're like from a place, like, on weekends I hung out with my friends from high school, and, we went, to Rincon and stuff like that. It was some karaoke, had drinks, and people sort of asked me, what are you doing? What do you do? Those kinds of topics. What I encountered was a lot of, not just disbelief, but like people kind of making fun of me. So, I remember on one occasion, my friend, she's from Lajas in Moca, like we went to school together. So we were in the Parguera area, and we encountered a friend of hers, and he was like, you're crazy. Go, if you want to study these topics, you got to go to Mexico or Peru. He was an expert on the topic for me. And, what that helped me see, I at first I would be like, roll eyes emoji and sort of like, mansplaining, my approach at that time was sort of like, okay. But, I took that in some ways too, to be a learning moment of reflecting myself and reflecting on other people's experiences and how we narrate the island as if it had a unique, linear only history that everyone should orient to and align to. So I learned from those pushbacks to think about what is the ground or the discourse or the way of seeing that's at stake, that finds it difficult to incorporate or not incorporate this part that makes this even a controversy or debatable. What are the ways of perceiving that make this an issue? So, there was a lot of pushback there. And, when I came back from the field, one of the ways that I sort of engaged with the pushback is I wanted to know what the pushback was. So Larry LaFontaine Stokes, he was on my committee, and it sort of helped me get some of those tougher questions from an island perspective that I wasn't going to receive from my anthro committee, because they had different sorts of readings or sort of perspectives in mind, which was largely set in linguistic anthropology, reflexive anthropology, and in Native American anthropology. And while I'm in conversation with those, they don't capture altogether the set of debates that I knew, whether I wanted to or not, I would be a part of by doing this work.
Yeah, and I should say, your book makes, it takes an anthropological approach, very like in the best way possible. But I think it makes such an important contribution to Puerto Rican studies. It's really framed within debates about race, identity, nation, about Puerto Rico. And so let's get into that. What's at stake? I love the way you frame that. You frame it that way in your book too. Like, why are certain people aferrados, right? Like clinging very strongly to a certain history. And it's fascinating how people who are, who understand that history is written with certain perspectives in mind, that we have to question official narratives and official history. And yet there's something about the history of Taíno extinction that's just fact, and that is difficult to penetrate that and question it. And if you do, you get mocked, right? Or mocked also for studying that, right? So help us understand how you came to understand it. Like, so you started from a perspective of curiosity and maybe even skepticism. What did you start to find, and how did it start to change your view?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And to start, I'm going to go back to a part of your prior question that I realized I didn't quite address. Is there is actually quite a vital, I found to be a vital community of people who don't all agree with each other, who might have different kinds of perspectives in Puerto Rico itself. And what I realized is me not seeing that had more to do with the worlds I inhabited and the circles that I was in, or the family stories that I was privy to, than whether it has been there or not. So, you know, I lucked into, I'll be completely honest, an entry into the project because my sister was at UPR and took an anthropology class with rest in peace, Yarimar who, Melendez, look at me, so she introduced me to a lot of the groups because she herself was trained as an anthropologist and was excited to sort of support my project without controlling it in any kind of way. So, you know, my entry, because I was going to like the festivals and whatnot, but I didn't know how to see, you know, the things that people saw in each other to sort of make community, because that's not how I was socialized to perceive in lots of ways. And what that led me then to is when I started to think through the work and think about what was at stake and think about my own perceptions of the island, I had to let go of the sense that I knew everyone's story and that I knew how people remember based on how I remember and how my family has remembered and what I've listened to of what my family has remembered. So there's a narrative in Puerto Rico where, you know, people will often, you know, the same guy who said to me, and I write about this, I think in the book, sometimes I don't remember what got the final cut. He said, you know, in Puerto Rico, no hay indios. Mi abuela era india, pero yo no soy indio. And that's something I had to think through, you know, how then do we think about ancestry, history, and identity and subjectivity in complicated ways, right? Like, how do we connect who has come before us to who we are, and how does that affect how we see ourselves and our role in particular spaces? As I started to think about the Taíno issue, the way that people foreclosed the question was through a sense of historical evidence. But, you know, in grad school, you know, you read Triad, you read people like, you know, Ann Stoller or whatnot, and think about the role of the archive, who writes histories, what histories reflect. And I felt like I needed to put my attention to Puerto Rico history as I learned it in question. And this was reflected in a lot of my conversations with people. There's one set of interviews with a particular activist in the west side of the island, who in the book is Tato Oaxaca, where he said, I'll stay in Spanish. Yo me salí de la escuela, basically, porque ellos me hicieron dudar lo que me decía mi abuela y mi mamá de quienes éramos. Querían quitarnos el modo de hablar. Y para mí, cuando yo iba a decidir entre quién iba a escuchar, yo iba a escuchar a mi familia, porque ellos saben quién yo soy. And so I thought about that. And I know some people might think oral histories are suspect, or ways of remembering through family, you know, are not vetted. But as an anthropologist, you know, I really want to listen to what people think about and how people come to form their subjectivities through different kinds of vectors. And that in itself then led me to think, okay, what, and again, I'm not a historian, but I found myself kind of going back to sort of looking at some of the archives that I sort of saw in related to Puerto Rican history and what I could find. And, looking at it through the eyes of ambiguity, ambivalence, of what's kind of happening at those times, helped me reframe what might be at stake in the histories and discourses that ended up getting produced about the island. So, I started to think about the relationships that get formed between different Puerto Rican populations and the formation of a racial order around colonial power that depended on indigenous extinction, really influenced by a lot of settler colonial literature kind of emerging in the US at the time, or invasive colonial, if you want to call it that, really looking at how, the genocide of the Taíno alongside the discursive erasure of the Taíno are necessary to produce control over resources, right? So in some ways, there is historically a sort of relationship to invisibilizing the presence in a way that allows colonial power to entrench itself and reproduce itself. And, then thinking about that, how then, once you kind of have the sort of erasure kind of happen post Bartolomé de las Casas, and using Bartolomé de las Casas as a justification for bringing in enslaved labor to sort of function as forced sort of a forced form of labor. Hypervisibility comes to play there in terms of then being able to check the boundaries between colonial power and those that are getting used. So I started to think through those kinds of forms of hypervisibility and invisibility that produce different kinds of approaches to maintaining colonial power that is dependent upon the erasures and the sort of dehumanization of different groups of people in different ways. And to then see that by going back and thinking through that, trying to look at the historical record, make sense of what was getting accomplished, and then think about how that leads to current orders today. So I know that I went back and the book goes more in depth, and these are some of these things are things that I'm still thinking about. But I think, we can't, like you said, sort of look at those historical records without thinking about what were the strategies that people were trying to accomplish in producing particular kinds of ways of talking about groups, of sort of highlighting their existence or not, and so on.
And once one begins to question, these assumed histories, what is a kind of different retelling, or what are the points where then suddenly you start to ask yourself, oh, well, I mean, one thing that struck to me in reading your book was your analysis of this category of pardo, because I have to say that I've always thought, I don't know what pardo is, and, it kind of sits there in our historical record, and it's repeated to us as a category, that was used at one point. And it's so can you talk a little bit about that, and about kind of alternative readings also, once you have this new lens that you are examining history with and asking new questions, what are the other kind of points of unravel that you found?
Yeah, I think part of the interest in the Pardo, beyond just reading, was personally having members in my family that fell in and out of Pardo categories, throughout the census. And that did two things, I think, for me analytically, realizing that these categories weren't fixed, that they were very specific to the context that produced whoever was reading the census, right, at that time, and whoever was sort of taking sort of notes on, the person and their physicality and their particular kinds of readings. But also then sort of realize that the category can change over time and it's just used to mark something, right? Like what I saw is it was marking non-whiteness in a specific way, but it's also not marking people as sort of negro, right, at that particular time. So that ambiguity for knowing what it is that they're trying to capture, instead of seeing it as something I needed to fix and resolve, let me think about, how is ambiguity generative to thinking about the negotiations that people are making in Puerto Rico around race, reflective of the visual sort of colonial racial orders that have been produced, over the past, since 1492, right? Like all of the 1493, I guess, those particular kinds of things. And I don't want to collapse one onto the other, because I think that, the way that the particular racial order forces and orientation in Puerto Rico towards particular kinds of categories as fixed essences is, again, the product of the colonial order itself. It's kind of what it's trying to do is contain people within these specific categories, but instead to see them as these ambiguous sites of negotiation that people are kind of working with and trying to make sense of, what do we call these groups of people? And, it could be lots of things. It could be someone that is mixed with any number of kinds of things, but not, bounded away, contained away from whiteness, without sort of being subjugated, and maybe in the same way as someone who would have been sort of identified as Black in Puerto Rico and that particular dynamic. But I thought looking at these as ambiguous and letting ambiguity not be, because I was getting stuck on finding lots of ambiguities in the record it was like analytically in the process of looking at all of this, I was like, this is ambiguous. Like I don't know what this means. And I was getting stuck. And I realized, why am I trying to resolve the ambiguity when there could be generativity in the possibilities afforded by not fixing the thing? Does that make sense?
Right, and yeah, because part of what you're trying to question is this certainty that with which people have said, oh, the Taínos were extinct, that's just what it was. They just kind of disappeared from the records, from the census, right? And instead of looking at how they kind of, you have the creation of these new blended categories and uncertain categories, right? And can you talk a little bit about how you started to think differently about the category of the Jíbaro as well in relationship to this?
Yeah, well, the Jíbaro was interesting because the way I first experienced the Jíbaro upon moving to Puerto Rico was so marked. I remember reading this piece, this part of when I was Puerto Rican, where Santiago also kind of points to this particular kind of tension between the celebration of the Jíbaro on the one hand, and the people who I saw get called Jíbaro, or the ways I was told I was acting Jíbara when I was like seen as not cool, when I was trying to encounter, and someone who's from San Sebastián, whenever I encountered people from like El Área Metro, who were in some ways more elite than me, or at least felt like that, like that's how the relationship felt. I felt like the specter of my jibaridad, being from El Campo, was kind of there, even though like, it became this sort of quality to put people down, insult them at the same time that it was getting celebrated. And I'm not, plenty of people have sort of looked at this particular issue, but then I became interested in then how jibaridad was part of the way of thinking nativity in Puerto Rico in the general, we already have that tension, but in the general discourse of taking ownership and, looking at like Pedreira and talking about, you have the Jíbaro, and then you have the Jíbaro campes, like the Jíbaro, like not so Jíbaro, like this sort of like making a general ownership over this particular figuration that in real life people seem to be very strategic about. So really separating the discourse on Hibaridad from the lived reality and looking at how those relationships kind of played out. Now, with the Taíno, that I sort of interviewed, and the people who are indigenous in Puerto Rico who don't think of themselves as Taíno, but still go back to the Jíbaro, Hibaridad became a sort of way of making sense of what's native to the island, knowing what ways Hibaridad was a site of maintaining particular kinds of practices, a particular kind of identity that then became co-opted and incorporated into the Puerto Rican national project in specific kinds of ways. And I found that discussion of Hibaridad productive for then thinking, again, this is another national symbol, Hibaridad and Taíno, and this is where, the work of Arlene Davila was really helpful. How is it that the debate over what has been made symbolic on a discursive level, playing into the claims of people who have particular histories and experiences on the ground? And how do we separate those in productive ways to sort of make sense of, it can be true that this has been risen to a national symbol, but maybe what people are claiming is not that national symbol. Maybe what people are claiming is a lived experience, a lived identification, a lived sort of way of remembering, a lived way of connecting to ancestry that in fact doesn't always articulate with how the symbol has played out. And maybe then in thinking about that, then how does the symbol, by incorporating these kinds of experiences, also form a dimension that invisibilizes the potential for thinking about these experiences in different ways that I saw, communicated in my conversations with Taíno. Does that make sense?
Yes, I want to hear a little bit about your fieldwork itself, and I particularly want you to talk about what it means to examine Taíno identity and movements from the perspective of language, because I don't know that would be the most obvious, and then I wonder if people think that just means that you're tracking the use of the word hammock and stuff like that.
I'm not that kind of linguist.
right. So tell us a little bit about your fieldwork and your approach with language.
Yeah. So the question that I started with, and I bring that to sort of think about my initial approaches and how those have shifted. The approach I started with was one that I was like, if it is true that, we don't have a record of Taíno sort of being spoken in recent times, then how do people choose or make choices about what to reconstruct as a Taíno language? Because I think this leads to a bigger question. If there's not one singular thing that people can kind of go back to from a recent speaker as fixed, then what do people rely on instead? And as someone who is trained within a language ideological framework, and what that means is how do people's beliefs about language impact how they speak, how they choose to think about expression and communication more broadly. And that's really where, a lot of the heart of my training was in. Then, how can looking at reconstruction efforts among Taíno potentially tell us something about people's ideas about language more broadly? So that was kind of the question, that I put in a lot of my grant applications and all of that sort of stuff, because that was what was driving me when I went in. Now, when I did the field work, I realized that the vitality of the movement doesn't lie in one singular agreement. Much like being Puerto Rican doesn't mean we all agree to the same idea about Puerto Rico or have the same politics or have the same future. It's the space of debate that kind of like opens up thinking about Puerto Ricanness, like the discourse, the debate itself tells you something. And I think within the Taíno, I saw that too, where there are debates, or, you know, I'm saying Taíno as a shortcut, not all indigenous groups in Puerto Rico claim Taíno-ness and sort of have other ways of thinking through indigeneity on the island. But within the different groups that I spent time with, there were a diversity of ways of approaching thinking about language, some of which were trying to reconstruct Taíno from the Arawak, others that were trying to reconstruct Taíno from sort of Mayan languages. And, you know, as we know, within Puerto Rico, pre and post-Columbian sort of times, if we want to mark it that way, there were migrations sort of from the different islands. So even within that, there were people who sort of thought Spanish could be a way of communicating Taíno-ness, because the Taíno-ness wasn't in the language itself, it was within them. So that was kind of the way I kind of went into thinking about the role of language. But it also helped me then think about, you know, what's fixing our categories, and how do our ways of thinking about categories impact the kinds of movements we take, the kinds of futures we imagine, the kinds of paths that we anchor onto. So in some ways, even though the project, you know, went in really focused on thinking about Taíno language and, you know, highlighting, you know, the way that it's influenced the varieties of Spanish we speak, even English and whatnot, because it was the source of a lot of those first encounters with this new phenomena that people were trying to, often colonizers were trying to make sense of. And we see that reflected in the colonial languages that we speak today. One of the things then that sort of led me to also think about is, you know, how do our ways of seeing the world more broadly, even beyond language, impact how we perceive things and what we anchor onto and what kinds of action we take. And I think that in itself, that language ideological framework had an impact then upon how I thought about the broader issue of identity within the movement.
Yeah.
Does that?
So I'm going to start to weave in some of the questions from the Q&A, and I will be combining some of them. So a couple of people are asking in different ways about DNA, of course, you know, Ancestry Dna. You know, tell me your thoughts about, you know, there's been controversy where sometimes, first on the one hand, like that we DNA and like the teeth stuff, you know, suggests that, you know, a stronger Taino presence than what, you know, the official history says. But is that the way that the folks that you are studying define Taino identity? And someone in the chat said, I have 15% indigenous. How should I interpret that? What are your thoughts about you know, DNA as a sign of ethnic identity, and how do the folks that you interviewed for the book think about these issues?
Yeah, the DNA stuff is complicated. And, you know, I want to highlight that when I did my research, Ancestry Dna, 23andMe were not what they are now. So I'll sort of divide up my thoughts on what was going on then and sort of thinking about what's going on now, kind of following one from the other. So DNA is complicated. So, you know, at the time that I was doing research, you had a lot of the Mtdna studies come out. And I was trained in 4-field anthropology, which means that I was trained in a program where I had to take biological anthropology classes, where, you know, one of the things that they taught us, even before I knew this would be an issue in the field, and, you know, for which I was grateful at having some sort of knowledge, is Mtdna is really tracking your maternal ancestry, right? So it really tracks, it like goes in directly from your mother and the mother of the mother. And because it changes so little over time, it can tell you a lot about that particular ancestry. Now, that is just like one person out of like all of the ancestors kind of over time in that particular line. So the way that, you know, I understood it personally was as an indicator of that maybe that narrative of extinction was not quite what, people were telling. But the Taino movements preceded the DNA stuff, right? Like the DNA stuff came after the Taino movements. So I don't know that at the time of my research, especially with, I ended up working with a lot of elders, that had anything to do with their claims. And I think, Lucaro Borrero, who is here, has written that the DNA, they confirm the DNA, not the other way around. Yes. And so I did not find with the majority of the groups that was something that people were relying on at the time I did research and with the people I did research with. Now, with one specific group, there was an interest in kind of getting that data. And I think part of the interest for that particular person had to do with sort of the pressures. How do you translate yourself or make yourself visible in that particular, and this again is not every group, and I'm very specific to, a lot of these things that you see, we're not always in alignment with everyone, but how do you make yourself, get yourself taken seriously? Like what kinds of evidence can you provide in a space that is not wanting to recognize you on any level? So I think there are pressures toward providing that kind of evidence beyond what started the movement. And that's, kind of what I observed was, how do we create specific pressures for proving something to specific audiences? And then when given, what things have been constituted as proof, it's seen as not enough or as problematic in all of these different sets of things. So the way I was trying to sort of make sense of that then is, how does DNA, and this is again coming from my anthropological perspective, DNA is tricky because, we don't have all the science behind it. People, I've been watching, I've been fascinated by the people giving their ancestry on YouTube. Like there's this whole genre of people like, I got my results, and and so I've gone through those, rabbit holes. And one of the things that, I've noted in sort of my own experience is how, those things change. Sometimes people do updates, right? Like, oh, we have more data, because the data is only as good as the populations that they have for those particular testing. So it's not very good for US Native Americans, because Native Americans, are not invested in at least, according to the work I've read from Kim Tallbear and all that, there's a questioning of what DNA can tell you. And in the context of the US, how DNA, people might want to use it to go against the sovereignty of the Native nations that determine belonging for those particular groups. So that if someone, gets a DNA test, that will somehow be seen as more important than the sovereign nations' determinations about belonging. Now in Puerto Rico, all of that looks a little bit different, in part because, there is not in the same way a federally recognized nation that determines that. And it, in some ways, hasn't reflected from what I've seen, Taíno, Boricua ways of thinking about belonging. And in this particular sense, then, the DNA tests have a slightly different function. And I think it does, from my perspective, it's potentially thinking about ambiguity again. We have these stories of a complete extinction, but at the same time, there is some of that DNA. But at the same time, I'll be very honest, DNA doesn't equal necessarily identity and subjectivity for everybody, right? So for people who already experience that identity and subjectivity, it might serve as a confirmation of what they already knew. For those who don't experience that identity, that form of creating identity and subjectivity, it may not. So I think it's an interpretive practice as any. Not everyone even wants to get a test. I think, you know, in terms of DNA, that's where my thinking is at the moment. I'm currently working to think about how I might want to analyze that sort of moving forward, but I don't think it closes or sets any sort of, I think it's complicated. It's part of the ambiguous interpretive practices that are part of this broader conversation.
Yeah, no, it's super complicated. That was such a great answer, Sherina. Thank you so much. And, you know, someone was saying in the chat how, you know, these blood quantums and biological notions of race, you know, do we really want to be perpetuating those? And do we really expect those to tell us more about who we are? So I want to combine two questions. One is, I know in your book you talk about different forms of narrating identity and narrating the belonging and memory, and you talk about is it la profecía, right? The kind of alternative way of thinking about history. Well, I was going to combine, but let me ask that one, and then I'll ask another one. So tell us a little bit about that. So like you're saying that the DNA stuff kind of comes after these Taíno movements have already been started. So what are the alternative ways in which they're narrating identity? And I should say, I know we have a lot of folks that you interviewed here in the chat. So and you know, in the movement, but I'm going to ask some questions for those who aren't familiar with the movement. But
and I want to start. Not everyone was like part of the group that oriented towards the profecía. So, you know, again, the vitality to me of the movement doesn't lie in everyone doing the same thing or agreeing, but in that space, that discourse, that space of debate and that orientation toward Taíno-ness. But within, one of the things I learned from thinking about the profecía, and, you know, as someone who sort of grew up within Catholicism and became a lapsed Catholic, you know, just, you know, very openly about it, except to my abuelita, who passed away. So anyway, sorry.
Sherina, just make sure you explain for those who don't know what la profecía is.
Yeah. So the profecía of Arasure was a profecía that circulated among some of the groups I worked with within Puerto Rico that foretold that within 500 years, or, you know, 24 generations, there would be a sort of return of the Taíno, that there would be a visibility again, and that within that, before that time, there would be a sort of quietness, a lack of visibility, in some ways to assure a particular kind of survival. Now, within Puerto Rico, the groups that I worked with saw the time that I did my research as like leading up to that particular period, right? So it was 2006 to 2008, and the profecía was sometime around 1511, 1512. So, you know, it was a very significant time. And what it sort of led to was sort of thinking about, you know, the visibility of the movement kind of happening in line with the prophecy, and what that sort of, what those sort of challenges would mean, and what sort of visions for the island would come about with it. So I spent a lot of time with one particular group, going to a lot of meetings, thinking about sort of things like access to burial sites and ceremonial sites, which, while protected supposedly by Puerto Rican law, in practice often unburied bodies, like as that kind of happened around Jacana, sent them for analysis to the US outside of anyone's knowledge, or without sort of a sense of accountability to sort of these populations. So I think like it was like a particular political time, a particular, you know, and still to this point, I'm just reflecting on when I was there. And so La Profecía sort of, to me, became a source of authority for thinking about how to make sense of events and think about things. And for me, what it led me to see is I can't assume that the way I see the world and the ways that I understand the connections between things are the way that everybody shares in. There's like not one epistemological or way of knowing that I can use to measure the actions of others. And in some ways to do so is recolonizing, right? Like there's like a certain kind of way of assuming that your way of thinking and your way of seeing things and anchoring things is how you should evaluate other people. And we were at, I had to like be socialized into, so much of like my questions were reformulated for me. So I would ask a question and people would be like, this is, what I'm going to answer. Do you understand? And I'd be like, this doesn't seem connected, but it's because I was anchored in my own way of assuming logics, assuming connections. So the profecía, is a way of me making sense of what for some people were a particular entry into seeing the world and seeing connections between things, seeing who can speak, who can communicate, who you can have conversations with, what protocols I need to, like, as we see, like with, go into sort of asking questions. A lot of people were very generous with their time with me and very patient and graceful, because I went in, sort of, what is language for you? And, that was a question that people were just like, why don't we think about communication and who can communicate and like when you can communicate, and, these very subtle ways of redirecting me toward, what questions I should be asking that helped me get a sense of having to unlearn along with the process of learning. So I think that for me was a lot of how I made sense of the profecía and how I've written about it.
Yeah. So a couple of folks asked us to clarify about pardo, like we kind of glossed over it and didn't give a good sense of what it actually meant. So if you could say more about that. And also our colleague Isar Godro wrote in the chat asking, can you talk a little bit more about how Afro-Puerto Rican, African heritage in general is celebrated or not as part of the Taíno movement?
Yeah, those are great questions. So in terms of pardo, again, I'm so in my ambiguous notion that I don't want us to anchor it, again, in anything essential. The way I see it in the records I've seen is a way of describing people that we might, that wouldn't be considered white, but that wouldn't maybe be considered Black in the context of Puerto Rico. And it was a census category, and it often happened when people did the censuses, like not how we fill it in now, but someone would go to people's houses and classify people. So for me, pardo was a way of describing that. Sometimes, family members who were pardo would sometimes also get called mulatto in other categories. So to me, it describes that space. At least that's how I understand it. But because it describes that space of not one or the other, it leaves open a lot of interpretive potential to me in terms of thinking about how in different places and at different times, it could describe, those indigenous groups or other kinds of groups that didn't quite fit within a binary.
Right, and so on so how does Afro-Puerto Rican identity figure in? And someone asked, what do you make of the argument that these movements are to some extent a product of anti-Blackness, which is a common question.
So I have an answer for each of those questions that comes together, but are going to start from different kinds of scales of observation. Within the Taíno movement, many of the people that I talked to did sort of speak to having in some ways it wasn't completely separate from thinking about being mixed, right? I think what people were divesting themselves were from the racial triad. So the racial triad is a way, on the one hand in Puerto Rico, so you kind of have this racial triad idea, todos somos X, Y, and Z, right? We're all blanco, we're all negro, we're all indio. And there's a form of violence that's inherent to the racial triad as a discursive form. And that violence is, as I've seen it, the violence of having people who do not share in your identity tell you that you can't make a claim, or that you can't, or that your experience isn't valid. So I've seen it in people saying to people, oh, there's no racism in Puerto Rico, and then claiming a particular kind of ancestor. Well, Puerto Rico is not outside of the racist sort of racial order. There are ways that exclusions happen very clearly, and subjugation is attempted on the basis of sort of racialized perceptions. So on the one hand, I think what I understood people to be saying is, I reject that order because it's the order that invisibilizes me and makes me impossible. And so the motivation or I don't want to say motivation because you can't always get to that, but the explanation that I often received from people was one where I understand that on the one hand, I have these different kinds of ancestries and heritages, but the cultural forms, the experiences of identity and subject formation that I received through my ancestors were Taíno, were indigenous. And so that's one way people responded. Another was people claimed being Afro-Indigenous. So there were people who just said, these are not mutually exclusive categories. In fact, in my last meeting with Jade, one of the things she was sort of talking about when I sort of was talking to her was how, in her work, which was largely in Boricua and Maunabo, she found a lot of people saying, when through these particular oral histories that she told me that she had encountered, was that these communities in Puerto Rico came together, often looking away from the colonial eye, coming up with their own particular practices and attempting to sort of escape a particular kind of colonial state power. So that the formation of these as mutually exclusive categories was one that was getting interrupted by people on the ground. In terms of thinking then about issues like anti-Blackness and Taíno-ness, what I find useful to think with is, how has the Puerto Rican racial order produced a situation where the potential for communities to come into coalition with each other against European-based state power and later American state power became a competition for resources and visibility to the colonial eye. So for me, then, what I was left with in looking at these particular issues is, how do we go to reanalyze the systems that have produced a particular kind of racial order and put those into question for how they have organized the relationships between populations in Puerto Rico. So on that particular scale, which I know is like more abstract and a little bit more pulled back, what I sort of sit with and contend with and think through and find to be important is, how do the forms of colonialism that the island has experienced, first Spanish and then US, create a situation where we propose that these two different kinds of subjugated populations within the racial order historically are seen as mutually exclusive, in competition with each other, and as one anti the other, versus both products of a similar colonial regime, a visual regime that organizes who I'm going to focus on because it serves me to identify these groups as sources of labor that I can empower myself over, and who do I invisibilize so I don't have any accountability to this particular population and their particular claim and resources, and how these then get used in specific kinds of ways to hide the role of particular elites in reproducing themselves, their power, and an orientation toward them as the site that gets to recognize and decide who gets what. So to me, especially in the context of Puerto Rican colonization followed by American colonization, and I'm seeing it now, again, how do we then see a situation where a particular elite group gets to hide itself in specific ways as both a colonial subject that empowers imperialism in specific kinds of ways by kind of cloaking itself through this idea of mixture, like, you know, I can't be against these things because I am also lay claim to your heritages, taking away the possibility of particular kinds of identity that I think impacts all of these populations. It puts into question the ability that we have to lay claims to our histories, lay claims to the memories, lay claims to particular kinds of knowledges in favor of a particular colonial orientation. Now, I know this is like, again, a more abstract view, but it's truly how I come to understand these kinds of questions is, you know, I can't empirically validate one or the other because I don't think that's the point. The point is, how do we think about the discourses that create the possibility for particular kinds of political potentials, for particular kinds of memories, of particular kinds of ways of building history, and how do racial orders come to be part of how we navigate that? So I don't know.
Thank you.
I got into a moment.
You got into a moment, but that was such a you know, beautifully complex answer to a complex question. So thank you. I really, really appreciate that. There's a lot more questions in the chat. I cannot pull them all, and I apologize, but I encourage everyone to get Sherina's book. It's incredibly readable and really opens up new questions for us in Puerto Rican studies. So I wanna wrap up with one question. Someone asked it in a funny way, and I'll kind of amplify it. But someone said, "Did you ever talk to Ricardo Alegría about the Taíno people?" But I think, you know, I want to hear that answer, but also hear in general what figures like Ricardo Alegría, who some people, you know, see him as having done a lot of important work to preserve Taíno artifacts, etc., and valorize that. How did he contribute to certain historical narratives of the Caribbean? And if I can tack a little on to that, just because we're running out of time, you know, to what extent is this a Puerto Rico problem and question? And to what extent is it a Caribbean question? And, you know, I feel like within the academy, there's a revisiting of the indigenous extinction narrative for the Caribbean as a whole, and a questioning of precisely this kind of rigid divide between Afro-Caribbean and indigenous Caribbean identity. So I kind of bundled a lot in there. So pick whatever you want.
Yeah, no, I think I have an answer for the two main parts, like Alegría as a figure and the question of the broader Caribbean. In terms of Ricardo Alegría, I have a story. I'll do it this style, a story from my field work that I think showcases some of the ways that people understood him as a figure. And, you know, in some ways, Alegría and the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture did a lot to cement this idea of the three races, of las tres razas in Puerto Rico, and elevate Taíno-ness to symbol. But in that way, in elevating it to symbol, also made it something that everyone in Puerto Rico could take claim to, including groups that may have ended up using it to sort of have particular kinds of relations of domination over others, right? So, that was a complicated kind of thing that I felt in a lot of what people talked about. But for one person I interviewed, it was in fact the losing of access to Thebes as a ceremonial site, as she explained it to me, and one that was open as a park. People took a lot of issue with thinking of it as a parque, like a recreational site, when it was sacred. It was, in fact, that archaeological work that was happening that people were very, like this particular person and persons she was in conversation of were critical of. There was a criticism that claims over Taíno-ness had been taken away in specific ways defined by specific populations and relationships, and access to continual practice in favor of becoming a national park, a national site that you would have to pay for to get access to, and that you had no rights to. So in that way, for that person, it was a controversial figure who came to define how others interpreted their representation of Taíno-ness. So the forms of description that became overworked figured a timeline for Taíno that relegated it to an archaeological past that was not lived, that was not concurrent, that kind of gave it a particular temporality, a particular way of expression that people found quite confining, because when they encountered people, they would get measured against that symbol instead of their own experiences and practices. So in that sense, for the groups with whom I had the conversation about Alegría and his work, that was one way that they interpreted it. Because I think it enriched for a lot of people. And it did also, Puerto Rico has a issue, like if you go onto eBay, a lot of Taíno ceremonial objects are getting sold from people who are, dig up land and find archaeological objects to them, which are significant sacred objects to others. And are in museums all over, and there isn't a body to lay claim on them, which was an issue for a lot of groups that I encountered. And then in terms of the broader Caribbean, this isn't something that is specific in that way to Puerto Rico. You have movements and people are in conversation that I was in groups with. So the idea that, people aren't in conversation with other groups, people would have conversations with people in the Dominican Republic. I know of a graduate student who's doing work on the Haiti-Dominican border and thinking about how ideas about who can lay claim on one side versus another side of the border impact the relationships, cross-border relations of people within sort of this Taíno heritage and ancestry and practice, and looking at how Afro-Indigenous sort of forms play out within sort of that border space. I've read work coming out of Haiti, out of Cuba, Jamaica, that are laying this kind of claim. And I think opening the space to engage in these conversations can be very generative for thinking about the Caribbean and its relationship to power, colonialism, and what sorts of conversations have already been channeled through a particular perspective that I think is the result of colonial relations. So it isn't just the Taíno. The Taíno are in communication. Like there was one group that went to, I want to say Dominica, to a group there and are trying to like engage in this emergent, what seemed to me like transnational way of defining relations between the Caribbean islands that aren't just marked by colonial borders and sort of colonial former imperial powers.
Well, thank you so much, Sherina. I've enjoyed this tremendously. People stayed logged on, but so I think they enjoyed it as well. And we have links in the chat on how to get Sherina's book. Highly recommend it. Thank you so much for your work. Oh, but I guess I should ask you, what are you thinking about now? What's your next project?
I have a few things in mind, and I think I'm actually moving. So I've been interested in sort of the more, on the one hand, there's a part of me that's really interested in the more visible to me on a sort of broader stage of Afro-Indigeneity within Caribbean populations, especially like Puerto Rico, for thinking about relationships to settler colonialism and anti-Blackness. You know, what do people kind of through an Afro-Indigenous identity and subjectivity sort of say to, like, are they responding to these particular kinds of ways of perceiving and seeing and understanding history that we can all, that I could learn from and learn with. And on the other hand, I'm really interested in really doing a project that reflects on my own family history. So my mom is from Vieques, but her family had gone to St. Croix for a particular period of time, and then came back to Vieques, and then went to, Dominican Republic, US, La Isla Grande, and then from San Sebastian to Chicago, and from there to other places. And I became interested in seeing that maybe as a site. So much of like my coming into anthropology was validating my own experience is not unique, but actually understanding that I'm part of a broader sort of community of people who have had experiences of displacement, of sort of questioning, of understanding, of sort of making sense of genealogies that, part of the issue too of historical memory and how Puerto Ricanness functioned, how indigenous erasure and enslavement function is really taking you away from your genealogy, taking you away from the ability to connect with, the people who have had to be resilient and had to be strong in all of these different ways, through trauma to bring us here. So by looking at that and understanding how do different members of my family who share in that ancestry come to anchor their language, their identity in different ways according to different contexts. That's kind of where my brain is. I'm really interested in kind of looking through that and thinking through that as an experience that potentially could resonate and tell us a little bit about Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans in the US and the diaspora in a way that moves beyond essential fixed categories, but that thinks through process, through agency, through history, through power, through colonialism, as parts of these processes. So.
Well, I look forward to all that amazing work in the future. So let me turn it over to Kimberly to close out our webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are elated at this lovely conversation between you, Sherina, and we're so happy that you came and you showed up, you showed out, and you just brought a great time and great conversation. I put it in the chat several times and I will put it once again, but please go out and purchase Sherina's book and learn for yourself what we've been talking about here this entire time. We are, again, so happy to have you all here, and we look forward to seeing you in the future and having you here at more Centro events.